All right, welcome guys. I got Thomas Jockin with me. We're going to be talking about the body.
Actually good. It's a good life. So why would you want to give it up?
Right.
Aristotle says it's not for nothing. Instead, it's for the beautiful. It's for the divine. That's the point, which is from that perspective, it's not nothing. It's you're getting actually the better deal. It's perfectly rational.
Right.
But that's to be an Aristotelian or a theistic account about that. For those who don't have that account, yeah, it does look like nothing. It does look because they don't have a conception that even be aware of that.
Right. And this is the thing that like it's interesting because like from the psychoanalytic point, right? McGowan's trying to answer. So what would move someone to find enjoyment in the loss? And his answer is death drive. Because like this is where he says like Kant doesn't give, and this will be very interesting to talk to Luber about later. He says Kant doesn't give a impetus for why somebody would be moved to do something like this, to actually go into the moral imperative, like what drives it. And then when I told Luber this, Luber's like, Kant answers this. It's God.
Yeah, that'd be my answer. No, it's the following of the moral imperative is the operation of God. Yes.
Right. And like when Luber said that, I was like, yeah, I mean that seems right. Like that would be the imperative. But I did find that odd that, I mean, of course there's, the discussion, the problem of God in that, but I feel like if they were to raise something like the problem of God, I would also say Death Drive has its own like uncanniness to it, because for some reason it's basically McGowan saying it's Death Drive's first principle. It's what undoes life and also what basically gives life in a way, because it's what impedes ethics and then also makes possible ethics. So it's like this very driving force. And then the other thing is, when Freud he eventually he came across two problems. When he had the idea of the pleasure principle, he's like, oh, we do everything out of the idea of because we get pleasure from it, so it's the pleasure principle. But then he started running into this issue of like, wait a second, why is it that for some reason we get pleasure from doing things that are actually bad for us?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So then he started like getting this idea of like the death drive. And then like he didn't quite combine them, because they talk about like, I think Freud really like kind of was a little bit distraught about like how the death drive actually might be. I think eventually he kind of admitted like the death drive is just, it's not death drive and pleasure principle. It's actually really just the death drive itself that gives the pleasure and the destruction. But people like McGowan and Julie Resch, it's one. It's the death drive that gives all of this. So it's the very impetus and also the very obstacle for all these things. But I think even though there'll be disagreements, from where they're coming from and where you're coming from, I guess what I'm trying to say is, and I think the noose is a good point, but I think what's interesting is like the body thinks, then like I feel like the body itself is the very ethical limit. Is a kind of, it's funny because it's like we may not be able to have like a ethical limit in the sense of like a hierarchy of limits, but like in the sense of like the bare minimum of ethics is that I have a body. Like, and then from there,
well, wait a minute. Actually, I mean, I can be sympathetic to this account, just on this one part. I'm going to borrow from Daniel Gardner the whole problem of the particular substance, primary to secondary substance. That tension between the two, which is a Aristotelian landmine of disaster, because this was built. This is how nominalism showed up, and any old school Aristotelian would say, "Oh, it was a disaster ever since nominalism showed up as a status of ontology and epistemology." Here's the issue: particulars, powering substances, are definite. They're definite, but they're not defined. Secondary substances definition is defined. That gap between the definite and the definition, there's great turmoil and tension, because the question is, what is it to be Thomas Jockin? What is it to be Javier Rivera? And just the answer, you're a man, you're a human being,
right,
has a gap. There's a kind of tensional gap built into that. And especially when it has to be answered, that question has to be answered in time. Biography is the only way that gets answered, of response of that individual to their particular circumstances, to basically reveal what it means to be a human being for Thomas Jockin and Javier Rivera. So there's a kind of carrying in of the definite has the problem of it's actually ironically indefinite. It has it's not defined, but it's definite. That's the tension. There's like a ontological tension built in right from that moment. That only in the playing out of time and the ethics that come, the moral stand, because that's the thing. They think about what's character's moral choice in response to circumstances. It's only by that we really get the answer: who is Thomas Jockin and who's Javier? The answer of who, not a what, but not what is Javier Rivera, but who is Javier Rivera, can only be answered in biography in time, played out.
Yeah, and like this idea, this gap between the definite and the defined, is basically, I would interpret this as like Heidegger's ontological difference. Essentially, like the fact that,
think about like the they, right? That kind of stuff. Like that's always a big problem. The problem is becoming thrown into a culture, and we get told this is what it means. This is what it means to be a human. This is what it means to be a man. I know your gender, your whole discourse on gender discourse side is streaming in that. So much of the they kind of blowing through what they think, what is thought to be the man, be a man or a woman, but then everyone throwing against themselves against that and knowing that's failing across the board. And one could say it's called a death drive, basically. I started like rebellion of just confusion about how to respond to that and failing at how to address it.
Yeah, it's it's like, because I could take like a Heideggerian point of view where it's like they're just reducing themselves to a whatness. I am a man, I am a woman, I am this thing. But it's very interesting that nobody's preoccupied with who I am. It's what I am.
Because if it's not gender, then it'll be I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm an artist. Then it's title, then it's activity function based on commercial exchange.
Right, and that's still like, that's still like an indefiniteness, right? Because it has a sort of limitation on just like, I'm a doctor, but I'm also a brother, but I'm also a husband. But so then who are you? Like you still have that like pressing question of like, okay, then, but what, like, who are you? Not what are you? So there is that gap, and you're right. Time can only tell, which I think also Heidegger was on this same track too, right? Time is the defining thing. But what's interesting is like, if we didn't have a body, like time, there'd be nothing for time. There'd be nothing to persist through time. Essentially, the body would need to persist through time to be able for us to get to this moment of who we are, what we have chosen to be.
But you can challenge it the other way. You can say, if there was no time, there was no body. There would be no body. Like you can go the other, like just saying. And actually, and if we think about form, I guess the thing. So if we think about this, is not, I'm just referring. If we think about actually what is the form of Javier Rivera and Thomas Jockin, for example, one can make an argument, and it's a temporal form.
Right.
It's a pattern through time. It's a form pattern through time of interactions with others, right? And circumstances and conditions and limitations and failures and blah, blah, blah. That's the question. Now, if your Aristotelian point of view is, and anyone, any Aristotelian and a theist would say, oh, no, it's already decided. This form, see, that's those kind of predestination kind of problems or challenge, or it seems to be the case. It's like, wait a minute, that temporal form's already been decided, the foreknowledge about that pattern. But we need space to play this out. Especially if you make the argument that our form is what gives bodies its embodiment in the first place. The body only comes to be by ensoulment.
Right.
So if that's the case, and for individuals, we are temporal forms, then that means time came first. A shout out to Daniel. Daniel's a huge fan of this kind of argumentation. He may disagree with my formulation of it, but I'm just being cute about trying to play with that unconventional way of thinking about it.
There was a thing I was going to bring up.
By the way, one last note. I mean to bring this up to you for like the last half an hour.
Yeah.
Like the whole point that Aquinas includes in the moral virtues, justice and temperance, justice and practical wisdom, phronesis. He has them both inside the moral virtues with temperance and courage. So thus, when we say the cardinal virtues, what he's meaning is the moral virtues.
And those are in the body.
Those are all in the body.
Yeah. And like, this is where, so like, that's what's interesting, because I almost want to say postmodern ethics has sliced in half Aquinas's, and I guess Aristotle's in this too, idea of theological virtues. Like, it's completely cut off from that, because now what we're talking about is moral virtues. And I guess like postmodern ethics would be within the realm of moral virtues, essentially, which is always a weird problematic, in my opinion, because the only people that I hear about, like, talking about like something like forgiveness would be like people like Derrida, I guess Levinas too, because he has a sort of masochistic logic to it, where you give yourself up for others. But it doesn't quite, and this is interesting, it doesn't quite address how this is possible. How this is possible. And this is the problem that I noticed in McGowan's essay, which was, if both are technically pleasurable, let's just say one compensates, whatever. I mean, they're still getting something out of it, even though McGowan's like, this is why they're, stuck in a kind of like repressive regime or whatever, because they're like compensating. My problem was, even though the technicality of this is the death drives unconscious, so that also kind of coincides with this idea that virtue should be easy, not like something hard to do, right?
Yeah, because your body's not attuned to it. That's the point. The awareness of pain. Because pain, very important note from pain. Pain from Aristotle is a sign of basically violence and basic separation of likeness from substance and lack, by the way. So when you see pain, it's a sign of lack.
Okay. So yeah, so that this is,
and pain, by the way, is in the body. Like, that's the point too. Pain is information from the body. That's why I'm bringing this up. Right.
So the thing that's interesting is like my whole contention was like, I like McGowan's logic on this, because I think he's basically saying virtue in a way, the enactment of virtue easily through the unconscious of the death drive. The problem that I had, though, was So how are you convincing someone to transition from one form of self-destruction to another? Like, how? Because the alternate, the one that's, you could say the one that is a virtue, isn't necessarily the one that's going to be the most convincing on that account, right? Even if I could glimpse, and like he almost kind of gives example of like glimpses. He talks about like an episode of Mad Men where one of the guys is getting blackmailed, and out of just like this kind of momentary thing, he refuses to be blackmailed and just tell on himself. But if that's how virtue acts, I'm not sure if that's going to be like a convincing account for me. It gives me a pretty convincing account how Death Drive can be ethical, but it doesn't give me it doesn't give me an account of how one can transition from the other to the other. It almost sounds like you transition on a whim. And that is where, because he's basically saying, yeah, you find satisfaction in the lack, but how do you convince yourself other than by coincidentally falling into a I feel like there's a praxis involved. That's my main point. There's a praxis involved. The body is the missing element to this formulation, meaning that because virtue can't be taught, and I still think this is interesting, the body is the very thing that can emanate virtue by its masochistic practice of enjoyment in lack. Like that's the only thing. That's the only way. Like it can't just be the death drive. It has to be a praxis.
I see. No, I see you're getting at. Okay, so a couple of notes. One is the reason why virtue is not here. From my health course, I'm working on right now, there's a concept called basically the difference between ethos and what's called inexy. Is this idea of change from within or change from without. Teaching changes you from without, in the sense that it's an external instructor giving you a pattern that you learn and then you can do. The example from Mino is wrestling instructor. If you notice all the examples of teaching that are occurring, they're techniques. They're learning methods. And Aquinas talks about this. You can learn basically what's going on is that intellectual virtues are being taught. Those can be taught. It's moral virtue, the cardinal virtues that cannot be taught. Why? Because that has to be what's called aptness in the soul. It needs to be there first. All that can be done is to position the entity, the person, to enact their internal virtue in the first place. It's already there. It just needs to be enacted versus externally given from without. Now I think you're right that normally it's just two notes. One is either divine gifts, right? If you use a theological account, what's going on there is that you're getting a spike of a spark of intuition, of apprehension of real reality versus falsehood. I think it actually, I think the idea of because remember, lack is not nothing. The kind of big idea from Daniel and myself is lack is not nothing, because human beings can't even apprehend nothing. That's one of my arguments, right? But we are driven to using the estimated power, which is in the body. We will prefer the better option, right? We will do that. So when we are apprehending a lack as an opportunity, we act on it. So your example was this individual saw, I can either be blackmailed or I can choose to enact, basically take that off the table by revealing the truth. And I think that's a better move. That's an act in the moment, right? It's an apprehension in the moment. How did that happen? Well, because he's in a body. That's why. He saw that opportunity and he chose, instead of that option, I'm going to do this other one instead. I think that's quite reasonable. And that's the point, is that part of the spiritual practice is to gain larger awareness of creative lack. Basically because in the activity of virtue, you're moving towards virtue, right? So you're going to be deficient, you're lacking. And actually, this is actually why the only training possible in virtue, the best you can do, is understanding, looking at exemplars. I had an essay a couple weeks ago about this. We learn to do well with two kinds of interactions. One is exemplars for the end, of what we're what possibility we could aim towards, and how and means to get to that, or prototypes. And there's something to say that, and prototypes can be different. It can be stories, narratives, or enactments. Think about the whole point of, like, when we talk to our friends about some event that happened in our lives. Part of our information we're getting from those stories is what happened. Let's see, what was the practice, the activity, the narrative that got to this outcome. So that's just as important as the outcome itself, is how it happened. And storytelling, shout out to Luber, is one of the ways we talk about that. So I use this language of prototype and archetype to talk about that. The archetype shows you the exemplar principle of what we're aiming towards. So that could be in a sport, a field of domain, a certain way of being that you want to be like. That's all you can do. And that's just stored in your memory. And that's the thing. What's important about that, it's stored in the memory. That's a pattern that you get stored in the memory. And then the storytelling, biography, narrative, storytelling, that is the means. That's what those are kinds of prototypes.
So I think you've connected it to me in the sense that now I would like to write this essay, but I would definitely need your help. So basically, what you've said to me is, if I were to do a 1-by-1, line for line on McGowan and like Aristotle Aquinas, basically McGowan said nothing different, in the sense of that if the death drive is what gives us possibilities for virtue, and also enactments of vice, and this is what it is, but you can only encounter this or have glimmers of this because you have a death drive. And then the Aquinas or Aristotelian argument is, you're able to do these moments of virtue because you have a body. But the main problematic that I was pointing at, which you elucidated on, was, but we can become more aware of our, like, we can expand our body thinking by doing certain practices via exemplars, via prototypes. So like, to put it this way, this is where techne relates to, ironically, learning virtue, but only in a very indirect way, meaning like someone can teach me meditation. Someone can teach me how to pray. I won't gain virtue because of that. But I will gain virtue by practicing the techne correctly.
Yes.
Right? Like, that's what's interesting about that. And this is why I like the idea of Heidegger's circumspection. Like, I really think he missed out on making the argument. I guess now I get to make it. Missed out on making the argument of body circumspection. Because body circumspection as an action of seeing is basically, because his wonderful example of, like, you don't know a hammer by just looking at it, you know a hammer by using it. Well, our body is the same way. But the uncanniness of it is the fact that the more that we use our body, the more we can encounter something like God, divine, beauty, the acquisition of virtue, which is very interesting. And it's very curious as to why, now I know there's an Aristotle answer, but it's very curious as to specifically why it's this body enactment versus theoretical acquisition.
Yeah.
Why? like it doesn't quite answer, like, why it had to be specifically one way or the other. It just so happens to be it's the body that is the very thing that not only if you learn techne, not theory, it's not theory that gives you virtue. It's techne, the acquisition of techne, that you can then acquire virtue only indirectly. And then of course there's, you know, the steps of like the grace given virtues. But just for the sake of just sticking it to moral virtue, it's just like the expansion of your enactment of moral virtues is predicated on your praxis of techne and expanding that capacity to do that. Other than that, it's basically all Todd McGowan said in a kind of way, and it feels rude to me. It feels like rude of me to say this, but basically all he said was in a kind of way, it's just like, yeah, you have, you can do virtue because you have a body. I mean, to be fair, like he is for the first time really making a connection from death drive to ethics, which is a very significant move in his essay. But just like to bring it back, just like the body, but still he's basically saying that.
Yes. I mean, at the very minimum, it blows up the head on a stick model. Right. It blows up that argument because the act of thought requires a body as an instrument for thought. Now, to be fair, in his point, actually, Aristotle has a point about this. He's like, okay, so what's wisdom then? What's wisdom doing with this? Is phronesis just enough? Practical wisdom, is that enough to get the job done? The answer is no, because you still do need the universals. But that's not sufficient. And this is his general critique of Plato, as I said at the very beginning of this discussion together. The application of those universals require particularization, which is phronesis, and that's part of the cardinal virtues, which all are related to the body. So, and their body, and actually, the safeguarding of phronesis is temperance and courage, because you have to be able to manage the passions in the proper manner and way. And a very important distinction, I think a lot of people treat phronesis, and temperance, as this kind of tamping down. That's not necessarily the case. That's generally the case, right? Tamping down to be mediated to the mean. But when it comes to theological temperance, and by the way, as a general theological account, all the cardinal virtues transform in theological virtue. They are transformed by the gifts. Aquinas has all these notes. Everyone remember from our reading group, it's really shocking that actually the activity of development of these cardinal virtues are to be towards God. Right. They are not just. Well, sorry, my speaker went flying away because I hit the table hard. It's not like it's literally to get the same thinking about things as God, awareness of God. Like it's like you're pursuing, you're like in a procession towards God. This is what we meant. So what's the purpose of theoria, the movement towards it, is to become thinking like God. And for those who are Abrahamic religion, specifically Islamic or Christian, we affirm that God knows the particular. So this is not necessarily some Neoplatonic stances have been that God only knows, and deist is that God is abstractionally just aware of the universal, right? It's just chilling in the universal, has no particular interest in the particularization. The Abrahamic God is not that. It's actually the opposite. He is very much in the business of you as an individual. That is a very radical switch of stance from these points, those prior points or stances. And that shows that, as opposed to a kind of gnosis stance, Gnostic stance of the body's useless, it's just an annoying vessel that decays and gets in the way of us actually using our mind to do things. This transforms to the other way. So no, you actually must train your body for thought. And by the way, we know this just on a practical level in terms of like brain fog. If you don't sleep well, eat well, your brain can't work. Not working very good just on that basic operation, let alone just, again, the operation of management of the desires and passions, and let alone becoming aware of increasing degrees of lack of a kind of procession of the divine by awareness of there's something more. Lack is not an absence of a nothing. It's an awareness of something more is awaiting. I talk about this, and it's generally why beauty is an incredibly hard, difficult topic. It's probably the hardest training required in intellectual thought to approach the beautiful, because you have to be willing to extend your memory and thought to the highest degree of relationality, and to kind of start realizing the identity of things is in relation. The best example I can give to this is the recognition of pi as an example, as just one illustrational example. When we realize that pi is not just a name of a random thing, it's a relationship of the circumference and the diameter of a circle. That is the identity of what pi is. So when we say pi, we're actually identifying an essential essence of circle. That's something more than circle. I say that because pi shows up it's a transcendental. It shows up everywhere in mathematical operations and in areas we don't normally think about. The normal distribution curve, motions of the planets, motions of atoms. It shows in probability distributions. It's all over the place. So the deeper so to say that circle is not true, but pi is it's in the body. Here, I'm gonna be cute. The essence of pi is revealed in the body of a circle, which is a relationship of the two parts of a circle, its diameter to its circumference. That is getting more to what beauty is. And beauty is that recognition of that universality of the particular, exactly the same moment.
Universality of the particular. Okay.
Because, for example, using pi to show this point by saying pi is absolutely, it's a distinct this, right? It's this. Pi is this, which actually, if you try to break and you try to convert it into a number, a numeral number, it's irrational. It doesn't work. It just goes on forever.
Right. That's what I was going to bring up. Yeah.
That's the first part. But then the second part is what I just said. Notice where it shows up. It shows up in the identity of the relationship of a body.
Right.
Being geometry.
Okay. I'm tracking now. Yeah. It's interesting that it has to be the body that's preparation for thought. And I think, it's, I still, again, I'm still like blown away that Aquinas even says something like this, where he says, the knowledge of God is not achievable. It's the love of God that is. And that is fundamentally rooted in the body.
Yeah.
As the love is the hunger, the desire, and he associate that with the corpuscience or whatever.
Concupiscible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that one.
It's probably, to be honest, it's both, because that's the start of it. And then as you desire and pursue that, it becomes the irascible appetite, which is the desire and pursuit of the difficult, the hard. So actually you can make an analogy that basically when you have a desire for goodness, right? That's a concupiscible appetite kind of motion. Truth is a higher abstractional thought, right? So that's a little bit higher up in terms of difficulty and motion and irascible. And then beauty is the highest degree of it because it's the most difficult. To quote from Plato, because Plato closes the Greater Hippias dialogue with that point. Beauty is the most difficult.
What's really interesting about beauty being difficult is now I'm gonna talk about the ego, because I've been
sorry, before you go in that pivot, I just want to bring up one last part related to geometry. I just realized I forgot to bring up. Aristotle points out that bodies contain geometry.
Okay.
Right, but they're not equivalent. The whole point is because geometry can be is a point, line, plane that is abstracted from bodies. So and notice geometry is the foundation of a lot of mathematical thought.
Right.
So also when I bring that up, just point out again, your interest in this body is very valid, because Aristotle has very clear points about this, that even mathematical objects like geometry are very bodily oriented. That's why I even use pi in my example with circle, because of this relationship. Just want to close on that note.
Yeah, I mean, I really like you bringing up pi, because it really shows like a kind of like uncanniness. Because it's like you can't even like translate it over to like a rational number. It just goes on and on and on forever. So it has to be like this symbol, essentially. which can only represent the body, the body of the circle, and that yet at the same time, that is like that to me. That's really mystifying, actually.
No, it is.
It's really mystifying
because that's the point. There's something excessive to a circle, right? It's circumference because the definition of a circle is a geometric shape with at a point with a central diameter of equal length. That's the definition of a circle. But within this definition, there's no pi. Pi is the essence that derives from that definition. Do you see? That's derived from the generation of that, from the definition of bodies generated, right? With that, and then in the enactment of that body, the essence of it, pi, shows up as a relational essence.
Right. Yeah. Relational essence. Yeah. That is what I want to get at with the body of ours, right? This relational essence, which is it's interesting because then it's like the discrepancy would be between it might be I could be wrong. I mean, I would say, well, I'm going to go into the ego talk because I think it's a very interesting relation. So I've been reading Subjectivity and Otherness by his name's Chisa. This is very interesting. I think you'll be interested in this idea of how the ego gets constructed. So it is actually related to the body. He says the ego, per Lacan, gets constructed via the specular image that the child sees through the mirror, or it can construct itself via another person too. Another person can be a mirror for itself. But it's not just the specular image that is seen. It's also the fact that your body is incomplete in the image. It's actually when you realize your body is incomplete because you can't actually see your body without the mirror. You can't see the totality of your body ever. So it's this combination of the mirror allows to present a unified totality of the body to you, like a cohesive whole. And yet at the same time, you realize without it, you cannot actually encounter a totality of your body. You have an impartial view. You can't actually see it. And he says these two combinations is actually what constructs the ego. It's actually what compensates the subject's lack, because what Lacan is being very careful about, he's trying to say the subject is not ego, but how do we get ego in the place of the subject? And it's exactly this movement of this specular image of totality and an impartialness, an incompleteness, basically, of the body itself that then is captured and is exemplified by the ego.
Yeah.
So I find that very interesting, because it's almost like if I were to say ego is like a really interesting mystification, because it's like, I would say the subject is pi, right? And it's when you try to translate pi into a rational number, you get ego.
Yep. When you use the naf versus rule metaphor from Sufi Islam.
I mean, no, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, it's like what you're getting at. Basically, like, so in mysticism in Islam, there's the idea of two kinds of souls, right? There's the rule, and then there's nafs. That's exactly what you're pointing out. One's an illusionary kind of runoff, indefinite, and one is the core essence that is definite in this, with full substance behind it. And then one's just a running failure, right? Basically, the whole point of an ego is a compensation for not being able, and it's not capturable. That's the point. It kind of fails in its capture of gathering together what is the substance of the thing. And by the way, I mean, this example of the image of a child, the kind of their spectral image and their reflective image and the completion of the body, of like not seeing it 360, the whole body in all directions. That's technically true with all objects. We never see any object in its full totality of existence. But you can even go up this with the human being, because I think this is why time matters so much, because that's a very spatial preface or kind of emphasizing. Shout out to Daniel. I'm going to play with the time one side is the idea of development, that you were a fetus that became a toddler, infant, then a toddler, then a teenager, then an adult, then a mid-age adult, then you're going to get old. That development phasing, right? That's not all being captured at once. That's generally a problem with nature and physis and nature, in the sense that you're not, when we see these entities that are stable, it's not just this particular moment. It's the fact that these things have a development, a temporal pattern. There's no way we get to, when I say development, it means temporal pattern, that there's some kind of knowable pattern that this entity, as this kind of substance, will behave this way, most likely. Now, it might be surprises, getting cancer, getting injuries, woundedness, but the fact that there's some kind of larger, like kind of presumption of temporal pattern that is where that's intervening or kind of occupied with this thing, that we know that it's in a relationship. These are issues of ego, I would say. That's where you can paint this out. Like, why does the ego show up? Because we have this need to identify things that have time persistence.
Right.
Not just spatial consistence or totality.
And it wants time consistence, and it also is trying to obfuscate the incompleteness, which is interesting, right? It's always trying to obfuscate that's why it's like I really think, like, the colloquial phrases like, this guy's being so egotistical or whatever, right? Like, it's a kind of like a pointing or indicator to he's not able to see past himself, right? He's already given himself a kind of representational totality. He's not able to see something past himself, something incomplete, something that's not him.
Well, I would say, he doesn't have a relational essence. Right?
No, yeah.
That he's just an egotistic person, is self-centered, it's self-contained in their interest, and they're pursuing their good and optimization for themselves.
Right. Yeah. Because it's like this idea of a kind of error in unity via specular image is precisely what obfuscates any idea of relationality. I would say it's because you have this unity implicit within yourself.